Feedback is information about an individual's understanding or performance which is used as a basis for improvement. Hattie and Timperley highlight the importance of feedback when they argue that feedback is one of the most powerful influences on learning and achievement, but this impact can be either positive or negative. Feedback is an essential part of education. It helps learners to maximize their potential at different stages of learning, raise their awareness of strengths and areas for improvement, and identify actions to be taken to improve performance. Feedback can be seen as informal or formative, which is the day-to-day encounters between teachers and students, or more formal, summative feedback, which is part of the written or clinical assessment. Feedback is part of the overall dialogue or interaction between teacher and learner, not a one-way communication. Today, I'm going to be talking about feedback. Specifically, I'll be defining what feedback is, examining the efficacy of feedback as a learning device, and looking into both effective and ineffective feedback strategies. Finally, I'll examine current feedback models. If a teacher fails to give feedback, then the student may think that everything is okay and that there are no areas that require improvement. Learners value feedback, especially when it is given by someone credible or someone who they respect as a role model. Failing to give feedback sends a non-verbal communication in itself and can lead to mixed messages and false assessment by the learner of their own abilities, as well as a lack of trust in the teacher. Feedback is essential to the learning process because it allows the learner to understand which areas their understanding or performance is lacking, and feedback is an incredibly effective teaching tool. John Hattie conducted a comprehensive meta-analysis of different educational elements to determine their efficacy on student learning. In this often referenced research, Hattie developed a way of ranking various pedagogical influences according to their effect size. In his study, Visible Learning, he ranked those influences which are related to learning outcomes from very positive effects to very negative effects on student achievement. Hattie found that the average effect size of all pedagogical influences was 0.4. Hattie described 0.4 as being the hinge point, a baseline to measure the efficacy of interventions against. So how does feedback measure against other pedagogical influences? As this table shows, Hattie found that certain types of feedback were highly influential on student achievement, having a 1.13 effect size. This is higher than the influence of a student's natural cognitive ability and clearly far above the hinge point of 0.4. Despite Hattie's findings, which illustrate that feedback has a positive influence on student learning, research suggests that this teaching tool is not being applied as often as it should. A study by Bond et al. Examined the behavior of 65 teachers and their use of feedback in the classroom. They found that most teachers provided very little feedback, and most of this feedback was delivered as praise towards students and not as information pertaining to possible improvements. In 2007, Hattie and Timperley provided a conceptual analysis of feedback and analyzed the evidence related to its impact on learning and student achievement. They developed this model of effective feedback, which identifies the particular properties and circumstances that make feedback effective. Hattie and Timperley demonstrate how feedback can be used to enhance teachers' effectiveness in the classroom and student achievement. Hattie and Timperley's model revolves around having a distinct goal or purpose of the feedback and providing appropriate expectations on the student's pedagogical progress. Their model requires that feedback works on 4 different levels. The task level, which is how well the task was understood or performed. The process level, which is the main process needed to understand or perform the task. The self-regulation level, which is the self-monitoring, directing and regulation of actions. And self-levels, which is where the student provide personal evaluations of their own performance. Another interesting model was devised by Pendleton in 1984 and requires that teachers check that the learner is ready to receive the feedback, then lets the learner give their own feedback on their performance before giving their feedback themselves, making sure that the observer is stating what is done well and developing an appropriate action plan to make improvements. Although Pendleton's model provides a useful framework, it has been criticized for being too rigid and formulaic. In 2005, Walsh adapted elements of Pendleton's model and combined it with elements of a model devised by Kurtz et al. To create an effective feedback framework. Walsh's model proposes that teachers Start with a clear agenda. Look at the outcomes that the feedback is trying to achieve. Again, encouraging the self-assessment and self-problem solving first before giving the feedback themselves. Using really descriptive feedback so that the learner understands completely what's happening. Making sure that the feedback is balanced and suggesting alternatives. Being supportive. And at the end, making sure to structure and summarize what has been learned. Hattie found that certain feedback strategies were far more effective than others. Interestingly, some feedback strategies fell below the 0.4 hinge point, so are actually found to be detrimental to student achievement. These included the use of extrinsic rewards and punishment, which some teachers might find necessary tools in their classroom management strategies. Other areas which can be detrimental to the efficacy of delivering feedback can include having a poor relationship between the teacher and the student, waiting too long after a performance to give feedback, being overly critical of a performance or failing to find something positive to discuss with the student, overloading the recipient with information by failing to identify just a few key areas that require improvement. The use of feedback in the classroom is a complicated topic and needs to be carefully considered before being utilized. Overall, the importance of feedback should not be underestimated. However, educators need to be aware of the various types of feedback and understand their context, and effectiveness. Feedback is critical, not only for improving performance and understanding, but also developing students' metacognitive abilities and critical thinking. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Parslow that suggests that communication is a two-way process that leads to appropriate action in the context of developing competence. It is not an exaggeration to describe feedback as the fuel that drives improved performance. Thank you very much.